everyone, and welcome to another, well, I guess part 2 of my three-part trilogy on versus battle shows. And this one is on Deadliest Warrior, which lasted longer than Animal Face-Off. Like, Deadliest Warrior had 3 seasons. Yes, it had 3 seasons. Whereas Animal Face-Off had 1. But it didn't last as long as Death Battle, which, well, has over 20 seasons. So, and I think I'm going to demonstrate why. So, you might think that if Animal Face-Off was on the, Animal Planet, that Deadliest Warrior might be made by, say, the History Channel. But I'm pretty sure History Channel was too busy filming Bigfoot shows to deal with, well, actual history stuff. So, Deadliest Warrior was done by Spike. Now, Spike TV is, it's a bit of a weird network by modern standards at least, because they basically did a bunch of different shows. Everything from cringe comedy to the more serious stuff. But generally speaking, Spike was sort of a hardcore show, I think you might call it. I don't know how else to describe the network. But anyway, Deadliest Warrior is one of their shows, and I'm going to comment mostly on the ancient battles, because I'm not as familiar with modern warfare as I am with ancient warfare. So, I'm going to go through, all of them. I'm looking actually at the Wikipedia page, because it gives the basic overview. But then, while I'm not going to comment much on modern battles, I am going to give a criticism of the modern stuff on the show. Basically, Deadliest Warrior, up until Season 3, is all about weapon testing, and even then, the weapons are the most important part of Season 3. But it's basically about whose weapons are better. And they don't test this well in the modern episodes of the show. What do I mean by this? I mean that they have different people use the different weapons. Which is a problem, because let's take the AK-47 versus M16, a classic matchup of modern warfare. So, when you have an AK-47 versus an M16, the two weapons aren't that different. They're both assault rifles, which are generally the same. And sure, there are differences between them. Some are genuinely better than others. But they're even enough that when two people are fighting and both have assault rifles, it's probably going to boil down to who the better shot is. Especially at the ranges Deadliest Warrior is testing them. It's not like they're testing the weapon's maximum ranges to see who could shoot the other before they go up to them. No, they're testing them at fairly close ranges, where things like how far the weapon can shoot overall don't matter all that much. And because of that, the guy who's the better shot tends to get the weapon and the edge. And I'm, of course, going to give a criticism for, the ancient stuff, too, because while weapons and armor are important, they aren't the only thing. The skill of the warrior is also important, as well as the tactics they would use. So, anyway, I'm going to go into every episode now. So, first off, every ancient episode now. So, first off, we have Apache versus Gladiator. And this matchup is a bit of a weird one, because Gladiators weren't... first off, the Apache were a tribe, so obviously they specifically mean the warriors of the tribe. But that's why it's a bit weird, a minor criticism, because, it's like saying Irishman versus Gladiator, or Scotlander, or Japanese guy versus Gladiator. I get that they mean the warriors of the Apache, but it still was a bit funny to think of. It's also a bit of a weird one because, I'll go over them. So, first off, we have, in the Gladiator weapons, we have the cestus, which is basically a sort of brass knuckle. Also the scissor, which is another type of brass knuckle, and they gave them the trident and net as well, which aren't a practical combination for actual warfare. Also gave them a sling, which is fine, it's a good weapon, and a short sword. Now, the thing is, most of the weapons the gladiator has are not practical for real combat. And the episode, because gladiators, okay, there is some debate as to whether or not gladiators were really fighting or if they were doing WWE style stuff where it was fake. However, even if they were doing stuff where it was fake, even if they were really fighting, the weapons were more designed for symbolism and making a good show. Sure, some of them were perfectly practical weapons, like a short sword, but others of them weren't, like a net and trident combo. Like, they're more designed to make a good show than to actually be good in combat. And probably in part because a lot of gladiators were slaves and they didn't want another Spartacus situation. But then again, I don't know how old some of those classes are, so I could be wrong there. So yeah, and I kind of do agree with the thing in the episode, like, but another thing to note is that gladiators were put in various different classes, and they gave more of a generalized gladiator. Though a lot of gladiators would have been veterans who were captured and enslaved after warfare, but others of them would have been higher, like guys who volunteered for it, or maybe just some buff blacksmith guy who was enslaved after the Romans conquered a place. Like, the gladiators would have also been trained, and this training would have been at least somewhat practical for actual combat, seeing as during the late Roman Republic there were some senators who used gladiators as essentially mercenaries for their various gang activities. So, or by the very least, having a strong guy who actually knows how to use a weapon, even if it's just the basics, is pretty advantageous for a gang fight. But yeah, I kind of generally agree with this result. Because the simple fact, though I don't agree that the fucking knife is a mid-ranged weapon, no. Like, the Trinette and Trident is definitely better than that because of the reach. But yeah, so, moving on, Viking versus Samurai. I agree with the result, but I don't quite agree with how they got to it. So the Viking has the great axe as a short-range weapon, a long sword as mid-range weapon, which apparently they call it that in Wikipedia at least, but no. They also paired up no, like that would have been the short-range weapon. If we're meaning great axe or long axe, that should be the mid-ranged weapon. It should compare the sword with the katana. Wait, hold on. Let me look at the actual Deadliest Warrior wiki. I'll probably. Okay, Viking versus Samurai, Deadliest Warrior Wiki. Yep, Great Axe versus Katana. Okay, yeah, no. So, if we're keeping the same weapons, the Great Axe should have been compared to the Naginata. The long sword to the Viking sword, I mean, because it's not a long sword by any means of the term, but the Viking sword to the katana. The spear should have been compared to. Actually, wait. Yeah, no, the spear. What the. Okay. Okay, okay, hold on. They had a great axe for the Viking, makes sense. Long sword, spear, and shield, whereas the samurai has a katana, naginata, yumi, as in a bow, and a kana bow. Okay, so a spear isn't quite comparable to a yumi, like, and the Vikings, like, because a spear is a melee weapon, even if it is long ranged, and they did throw it, but there's a difference between throwing a spear and a bow. And the Vikings had bows. It's not like they didn't. But, yeah, the comparisons are a bit bad. But now, why do I agree with the result, even if I don't necessarily agree with, like, how they compared it or all the weapons they gave it? Because, well, it's simple. There are a few reasons. First off, the samurai would have had... It depends on the era of it. There were times in history when the samurai overlapped with the Vikings. Like, the samurai were first really starting to be a thing in like the 800s or 900s, though there were proto-samurai before then. And the Vikings were around at the same time, from the 700s to the 1000s. But the samurai lasted longer than the Vikings. So if you're doing a composition of samurai, because the katana is actually a weapon that came about after Vikings were no longer a thing. It was invented during the Mongol invasions, or at least roughly around that period. The samurai used a different sword at the time the Vikings were around, the tachi. So, if we're doing a composition of samurai like this, then, frankly, you should probably give them guns too, or at the very least they'd have much better armor than they would have had in the Viking times. So, but even if you're comparing samurai to Vikings in period to period, even if we're assuming that the Norse are that these are the warrior elite of the Norse and not some farmer who decided to go raiding over the summer, the samurai fight on horseback. And yes, the Norse did know how to fight horseback. They used long axes against horses. But the thing is, we're talking single combat here, not army on army combat. In single combat, someone on horseback has a huge advantage over someone on foot, even if the foot guy knows how to fight them. And the Viking shield would be an advantage, but not necessarily much of one. Keep in mind that while shield use in Japan declined during samurai times, it didn't stop. And there were plenty of times when samurai fought people who weren't the Japanese. So a lot of samurai would have known how to use it, like how to fight guys with shields. So I ultimately think the samurai would win overall. Like, that being said, if the samurai was on foot during the Viking, then it was same period as the Vikings, I think the Viking would probably win. And the samurai is on foot in the show, but it's also a composition of samurai from all over their history. So with their better technology, I agree. Now, Spartan versus Ninja. They said the Spartan would win, and this is a bit of a weird matchup because, first off, they give things like the Ninja Toe, which didn't exist. So the Ninja Toe is an alleged straight sword that was used only by ninjas. Now, straight swords were used in Japan, and even in like the times when they used mostly curved swords. Like, we don't exactly know why, but there is some artwork of them. It is highly unlikely that these were special swords used by ninjas exclusively. Because, well, I mean, if you want to find out who the ninja is, just have them just strip everyone, see what weapons they have, find the guys with a straight sword. I find it more likely that the straight swords were either swords made with the non-folding steel technique, and with the non-folding steel technique, and that they were used basically to arm cheap infantry. Or an alternative theory I have is that these straight swords were actually imported from somewhere like China or Korea, and that potentially they were used by some people who, or maybe just used as a decorative item by some people who just bought them because they really like China. They also give them a kusarigama. Now, the kama itself is a ninja tool that was used for breaking bamboo fences. But the kusarigama, not really. And they also give them shuriken and blowguns, and not quite sure about blowguns, but shuriken are associated with pop culture ninjas in modern times. In period, were there some ninjas who used them? Maybe. But they weren't associated with ninjas more than anything else. Now, another reason why this is a weird matchup when you know more about ninjas. Oh, and they actually got a ninjutsu master as like a study guide. Okay, look, ninjutsu as a martial art is not what ninjas use. It's a con game by people who wanted to make money by selling ninja stuff. Like, the actual ninjutsu fighting styles they have today have nothing to do with actual ninjas. Anyway, in fact, ninja isn't even the period term, it's a later term. Shinobi was the term that was used when ninja were a thing. But anyway, it's weird because ninja was a profession, and anyone who was good at stealth could potentially be a ninja. Like, it depends a lot on circumstance and such, because of feudalism. But you could have a samurai who was a ninja, for example, or a ninja who was like a commoner. And pretty obviously, a ninja who's a samurai would be remarkably more capable of combat than a ninja who's a commoner. And also, if a ninja was going into a fight and they were a samurai, they're probably going to dress up in the full samurai regalia. Now, if a ninja was sent to, let's say, kill a Spartan and wasn't going to use their stealth, since, like, The guys even admitted that they didn't take into account the ninja's stealth for the fight. How would they do it? Well, here's what I think would happen. The ninja would go and buy a gun, then he'd go over and shoot the Spartan. Yes, ninjas in real life use guns. And I don't think the bronze armor a Spartan had could stop the ninja's guns. Like, we have accounts of arrows piercing Spartan armor. If an arrow can pierce through it, I'm pretty sure a bullet can. But yeah, so I think the ninja would win and the Spartan would lose. Anyway, pirate versus knight. So, they're talking about a pirate from the golden age of piracy specifically, because obviously pirates always existed. The only weapon I really have... Okay, I have a problem with two of their weapons. First is the blunderbuss that they give the pirate. They should have given the pirate a musket. Or if they wanted to give a shotgun, they should have given it a musketoon. The thing about blunderbusses is they were never really common. They're viewed as a bit of a joke weapon today, and they were viewed the same in the time period. Did some pirates use them? Probably, but muskets would have been more common, and musketoons would have as well. If you don't know what a musketoon is, think of blunderbuss, but the smaller, like, big flaring out thing in the barrel. Like, the smaller thing means that the bullets spread less and makes it more accurate. Now, for the knights, the weapon that I disagree with them giving is the Morning Star, or rather, the flail. Because, like, the Morning Stars, generally speaking, are anything like a mace or a flail that has spikes. And the Morning Star is the, well, it's like, the Morning Star they give knights is a flail. Now, flails did exist as weapons in both one-handed and two-handed varieties in the Middle Ages, and were used also in the early modern period. However, one-handed flails were rare. Most of the time when flails showed up, they were two-handed. And honestly, a mace would have been a better weapon to give the knight. And also, I should specify that they mean specifically knights from the early 1400s. They don't mean like knights from the 1500s, because knights from the 1500s would have weapons that are at least more comparable to the pirates. Like, 1500s era knights had guns. And that would be, and well, when you have a gun and are wearing a full suit of plate armor, and you're up against someone with a gun who isn't wearing a full suit of plate armor, well, unless his gun can pierce through your armor in one shot, which might not be able to do, you have a definitive advantage. But yeah, they said that a pirate from the early 1700s would beat a knight from the early 1400s. In this case, it's like, no shit, Sherlock, because of the pretty big technology difference between them. So now, moving on, there are some modern matchups before we get to the Shaolin Monk versus the Maori Warrior. Although, before we fully move on, I think that I have to give the show credit for the pirate, that it's the only warrior in the actual matchup that I actually kind of like the personality of. Because here's the thing about them. The pirate, he's just there to make money. He has his treasure and he's trying to leave. He doesn't want to be involved with this. He even tries running from the knight at one point. Pretty much all the other warriors are sort of generally, well, most of them at least, are sort of generic in depiction, generic brave warrior. They don't necessarily have any personality beyond being a warrior. Like, you don't necessarily, like, for example, if the samurai was about to lose in a fight, they wouldn't say, depict them as trying to commit seppuku to take away the shame of defeat and being killed by someone else. They don't say, have the knight be chivalrous in any way. They don't, like, give them personalities, but the pirate has a personality. He does not want to be here fighting a knight. He just wants to get his treasure and leave. But so I kind of like the depiction of the pirate. Anyway, Shaolin Monk versus Maori Warrior, and I do give the show some credit for selecting somewhat obscure warriors, but in this case the winner should be fairly obvious. That the Shaolin Monk, because the thing is, while the Maori weapons are in some ways impressive because they take various things from nature, like shark teeth and taking it into a club, and that is impressive, but it's also kind of literal caveman stuff. Now, against the Shaolin monks, with the Shaolin monk, they give a chain whip, took swords, a staff, and some really short-range piercing weapons. Now, these are actually accurate, at least from what I understand of what Shaolin monks use. But here's the thing: there were times when Shaolin monks used normal swords and spears. And generally speaking, the reason why Shaolin monks use weapons like hook swords is, well, twofold. One reason is there were times when they weren't allowed to use real weapons, and the other is because they are monks. The thing is, hook swords are not as good as normal swords are, at least in terms of normal fighting ability. What they are good at is disarming someone without killing them. And the Shaolin monks were Buddhist monks. They didn't want to have to kill people if they could avoid it. So, personally, I'd have the Shaolin monks have their more lethal weapons if they're going into battle to kill. Because, like, once again, Shaolin monks did use more lethal weapons at times, like normal spears and swords. Or if I wanted to give them more personality, I'd have the Shaolin monk use their more disarming weapons, and I'd have him take out the Maori warrior without killing him. This could have been, like, the only battle in the show that didn't end in death, as a basically way of showing how dedicated to Buddhism this monk is. But then no, they basically took the exotic, some of the more exotic non-lethal weapons, and weapons, and well, you still kill someone with them, but they're mostly designed for like disarming, and staffs. I mean, you can kill someone with a staff, still not that good for it, and that'd be like a kill. So I agree with the results still, but now anyway, William Wallace versus Shaka Zulu. I have a lot of problems with this fight. This isn't William Wallace versus Shaka Zulu. This is Braveheart's William Wallace versus Shaka Zulu. Now, I said William Wallace would win, and I agree, because, like, he has actual armor. And he has metal weapons, whereas Shaka Zulu doesn't quite have that. It's just more technologically advanced. And you'll notice that there are massive technological disparities between many of the fighters, which is why all the battles in the show are predictable, and I don't think they did a good job of selecting them. So few of them are evenly matched because, at least in the ancient portion, there are these massive technological disparities. So anyway, so William Wallace had a few different weapons. They gave him a warhammer, a claymore, a bowl and chain, and a targe and dirk. Now, this is accurate to Braveheart's William Wallace. At least I'm pretty sure he uses a warhammer, a claymore, and a bow and chain in that film. To the real William Wallace, it is not accurate. So, because, like, here's the weapons I give William Wallace if we were actually doing him as he would have been in actual history. For short-range weapons, he has a sword. Like, we know for a fact that William Wallace used a sword, at least at some points, because after a battle with the English, they killed the English general, and William Wallace decorated his scabbard with his skin. So, a sword. And not a claymore, those weren't invented yet in William Wallace's time, a normal one-handed sword. Now, for mid-range weapons, I give him a pike, because that is the big weapon of the Scottish Revolution that William Wallace used against the English. It ended up working out very well against the English cavalry. Not so well against their longbowmen, but bringing us to long-range weapons, yeah, I'd probably give William Wallace a longbow. Mostly because his personal sigil depicts him using a longbow. So, or at least some sort of bow. So even if it's not a longbow, I'd still give him a bow. And targe and dirk, I'm pretty sure targe and dirks weren't used in William Wallace's time, or at least the targe wasn't. So I'd probably just, I don't know, give him a dagger or something. Now, moving on to the Black for Blood special, they said a Spartan would defeat a samurai in single combat. And, quite frankly, with all I know now about Spartans, I find that completely laughable. So, a few reasons for this. As now, earlier I brought up the things about the shields, that samurai would have known how to fight someone with a shield, so not as big an advantage as you would think, but keep in mind as well that the Spartan shield was not designed for single combat. So how the Hoplon shield used by Spartans and other Greeks at the time works is it covers part of you and part of the man to your right. Alright, no, wait, part of you and part of the man to your left. Yes, the right was the weak side. So basically, if you were using it out of formation, or you were in the as far right as you can go, half of your body was uncovered. This is why they put their best soldiers in the right flank. But because of this, the Spartan shield for single combat isn't even as good as the Viking shield. Now, the next reason is because of the technological difference. Even aside from the horseback thing, but like, oh no, okay, so the Spartans basically stopped being warriors in the Iron Age, as in like BC times. Like I said earlier, the samurai were around in the like starting in the 800s or 900s. Actually, let me check. The guy who was known as the first samurai is Tyranno Masakato. He's from 903 to 940, so 900s. That's, even if, like, now keep in mind that even at 1 AD, the Spartans weren't a warrior culture. So that's over 900 years of technological difference. And also, the samurai, there's the horseback thing as well. But I would also say the samurai is probably a better fighter than the Spartan, as in more skilled. And I say this because the Spartans are a bit overrated. So the whole agoge thing, that basically comes from the descendants of the warrior Spartans exaggerating it to basically sell tickets to their Sparta-themed amusement park. And what happened, the actual agoge during the period when the Spartans were active was far less harsh. The children would have been allowed to bring food from home. They would have gone home after school rather than being brought out there. And also, there would have been pretty much next to no weapon training. Most of the training the Spartans went through was physical conditioning. And while that is important, any weapon training they would have went through would have been done by their king or other commander when they were marching to battle. Whereas samurai had physical conditioning training, and they trained in weapons all the time. So, in terms of sheer skill, if we go by training alone, the samurai should be significantly better than the Spartan. Maybe not in as good shape, but he'd still be in good enough shape that I don't think it would make much of a difference. So, that's Season 1. Now, let's move on to Season 2. So, one of the first battles, the first ancient battle is Attila the Hun versus Alexander the Great. I agree with this outcome that Attila the Hun would win, because, well, Alexander the Great, I can just look at the Wikipedia article. He was active from 340 to 323 BC, and Attila from 406 to 453 AD. Yeah, no, that is a pretty big difference. And yeah, sure, it may not be as big a difference as some of the tech differences we've seen on the show and will see, but come on, it's different enough. Aside from that, they gave Attila a lasso as his mid-range weapon, which, stupid, just give him a spear. Yeah, I think a composite bow is fine as his long-range weapon. Don't know why they gave him a Scythian axe when Attila was a Hun and not a Scythian. But you could have given him, or why they called it a Scythian axe. And also, the Attila the Hun versus Alexander the Great is basically a 5v5 battle. And ballistae weren't good for that type of warfare. They're more large battlefield weapon or siege weapons. They're not designed for, like, sniping someone, essentially. They're more for, like, shooting at large formations, people on walls, or people advancing to people on walls. So I agree with the outcome, but not a few of the details there. Now, Aztec Jaguar versus Zombie Warrior. Okay, so a friend of mine talked about this as well, like a friend of mine on DeviantArt, and, well, we both agree that the Zonde would win because he has iron weapons, and the Aztec Warrior does not. But there are a few details of the Aztecs that I think he'd want me to cover. So, first off, the Tecpatl. Oh, actually, so first off, I think you want to talk about the Jaguar Warrior's depiction of the show, because it is not accurate to how they originally looked. That's how they actually looked. Like, they looked differently. But anyway, So, like, I'm probably just going to show up some pictures, so look at them. But moving on, we have, for short-range weapons, the sacrificial dagger against essentially an agricultural tool that was sometimes used as a weapon, or perhaps no, actually, I think it's like a sword. Hold on, let me double check. Yeah, like, so the macabre, which is like a long knife, and quite frankly, they shouldn't have had the sacrificial dagger, because, like, they wouldn't have used them in combat. The sacrificial daggers would have been used for human sacrifice, and that's it. They wouldn't have been used in an actual fight. And I doubt the Jaguar warriors would have been wielding them. It probably would have been some priest who was. Now, next up, they compare, for mid-range weapons, they compare the obsidian sword to a spear. Personally, I'd have given the Aztecs the obsidian sword as their close-range weapons, and I would have given them their own spear for the mid-range weapons, because, like, the Aztecs use spears. They have that piece of technology. So that's what I would have done. Anyway, they compared the Atlatl to a sort of weird axe-knife hybrid thing, and I don't really have any objections to the actual weapon choices. And for special weapons, they compare a bow and arrow to, come on, a bow, another bow, or at least that thing. Yeah, for, let's see. Yeah, oh, to a sling. Okay. Okay, for special weapons, they compare a bow and arrow to a sling, and the bow wins. So yeah, not really great surprise there. Now next up, they have Roman Centurion versus Rajput, and look, I'll just use their own dates to tell you who won this. The dates, well, they state the Roman Centurion to 120 AD and the Rajput warrior to 900 AD. Now, in actuality, Centurions didn't just stop existing in 120 AD, they were around for hundreds of years. And the Rajput warrior was around for hundreds of years as well, but either way, the Rajput was more advanced. They also gave the Lorica Hamata to the Roman Centurion, which, yeah, you could find it in that period, but, okay, so the Centurions were, you could have also seen Segmentada, but anyway, the main objection I have to this battle in terms of the results and such is actually that they gave the Roman Centurion a scorpion, like basically a ballista. This battle in the show is single combat, and he's bringing in a siege weapon to it. They had entire crews to use ballista, or at least they had multiple people ready to help reload and such. Or even if they had one person, it was shooting at a big field. This isn't like the sort of thing you shoot at one person to snipe them out. So yeah, I would give the Chakram an edge over the Scorpion, because you probably wouldn't be able to hit your opponent with the Scorpion. It's not designed for single combat. Also, I wonder why they chose the Roman Centurion specifically and not just a normal guy. And, Somalian pirates versus many. Oh yeah, I remember that episode now. Forgot it for a second. Yeah, okay, so anyway, they also had the Persian Immortal versus the Celt, and this is a battle that kinda, sorta weird. Okay, so first off, they have them fighting on chariots, which would only make sense for the Celt, because the British. Okay, so a Celt is a specific person from a culture, like Irishmen, or Scot. Well, the Celt's bit encompassing Irish. Okay, you know what? A Celt is an ethnicity and a cultural identity, and a Persian Immortal is a specific warrior. Saying Persian Immortal versus Celt is the equivalent of saying who would win in a fight, a guy from the American Special Forces or a British man. One is incredibly specific and the other is very broad and generic. The Persian warriors were also not the Persian Immortals were also not a chariot-based force. The Persians used chariots at times, yes, but the Persian Immortals were infantry. Now, the Celts, on the other hand, they definitely used chariots as well as normal cavalry. Like, there were a lot of Celts throughout all Europe. And frankly, like, frankly, I think that whether or not the Persian Immortal beats the Celt would depend entirely on which era of technology we're talking about. They're talking about Celts in 400 versus Persian Immortals in 500. I'd say that's close enough that the Persian Immortal, an elite warrior, would probably beat a normal guy. But, like, but as you get further advanced, obviously the advantage would favor into the Celts, so I kind of agree with the Immortal and the technological eras they go for, but they were an infantry force, so I don't know why they gave them a chariot and a bow. Well, I know they gave them a bow to fit with the show, but... Anyway, Vlad Tepes versus Sun Tzu. So, I have a few problems with this episode. First off, this is both the most one-sided episode in the show in terms of the technological eras and the actual results of the weapons. So, Sun Tzu was around in Bronze Age China. Vlad Tepes, by most estimations of how long that era lasted, was around at the end of the Middle Ages and the start of the early modern period. Now, in terms of the show's one-sidedness, this is the only episode. So usually in these shows, they have one guy have two of their four weapons get an advantage, and the other guy has like two of their four weapons get an advantage. This is the only episode where Vlad gets advantage with three of his four weapons, while Sun Tzu only got an advantage with one. Yeah, so I think it's pretty obvious that Vlad wins, but also another thing that I don't really... So I'll get to the weapons, but I don't really like their depiction of Vlad because they try to portray him as more of a brute and Sun Tzu as more of an intelligent strategist. In reality, Vlad Tepes was a brilliant strategist and brilliant tactician as well. Like, his impaling and other brutal stuff, that was a part of his strategy. He didn't do it just for fun. No, he did it as deliberate psychological warfare against the Turks because with how heavily outnumbered he was, he kind of needed to do everything he could to stand a chance of winning. And they basically just focused on some of the brutal stuff Vlad did rather than his actual military brilliance. And even if you want to say that Sun Tzu is a better tactician, you don't want to say he's a better strategist too, he isn't better enough to make up for the massive technological difference between them. Yeah, so... Also, they don't... Yeah, also, a bit nitpicky, but... They also go into the... They also demonstrate a method of impaling, and while that was one method Vlad would have used, there were multiple methods for impaling someone. Some that would keep the victim alive for days. And these methods were used by the Turks, which is almost certainly where Vlad learned them. And probably why he didn't really have any sympathy for the Turks when he impaled them. But anyway, now the weapons. So there are a few weapons I have objections to. So I don't really have objections to Vlad's weapons all that much. So they gave him a Turkish saber, or scimitar if you prefer, called a kilich as his close-range weapons. I could see Vlad Tepes using that because he was trained by the Turks, so maybe he would have used that. Also, a halberd, sure, I could see him using that potentially in a melee battle if he's on foot. Steel crossbow and hand cannon, yeah, I mean, I doubt Vlad would have used them himself since from what I could read of the accounts, he personally used melee and tended to leave ranged weapons for the infantry. But yeah, I could see that, though I do object to his armor, plate and mail, or whatever you want to call it. Vlad would have had a suit of plate. Like, he would have been able to afford a full suit of plate. So, no, he would have had better armor than that. Now, Sun Tzu has the Jian, which, accurate, repeating crossbow. So, I somewhat disagree with the repeating crossbow, because, like, two reasons. First, I'm not sure if it was around in Sun Tzu's time. There are artworks depicting it at a time before it was allegedly invented at, so I can't object. So I'm not objecting too strenuously in this regard because it might have been, but I'm not sure. However, one of the things that I can say is that this was a civilian weapon. The repeating crossbow, while it probably was used by someone in the military at some point, was by and large a civilian weapon designed for self-defense. And it was mostly used with venom designed for killing tigers. So the so basically it wasn't a very lethal weapon. I would have definitely given the steel crossbow the edge over it. And now the real objections. First, the Zua. So the Zua is essentially a weaponized back scratcher. It's a pole with a cat claw at the end of it. I actually did research and looked for Chinese sources on it, and there were and now it might be because these might be more common, but these sources weren't in English. But from what I could tell, almost no one used this, and it came about after Sun Tzu's time. So now, personally, I would have probably given Sun Tzu a spear or a halberd because the Chinese had halberds too. But now, finally, the flaming arrows weapon. I wouldn't have given him it at all. Did flaming arrows exist? Yes, they did, but they were highly situational. They were only used in siege warfare and naval combat. And for a fight like this, single combat, a normal arrow would genuinely be better. And I'm also not sure if they existed in China at Sun Tzu's time. There are different ways of making flame arrows, and the most effective way of making them is to use gunpowder or some other chemical cocktail. And now, as a final note for this fight, before we move on to the last two, quite frankly, honestly, the start of it is just hilarious, and I don't think intentionally so. Basically, Sun Tzu's sitting at his camp and just making some tea, and Vlad decides to pull a prank on him by shooting his teacup with a hand cannon. And for this minor prank, that Sun Tzu decides to kill Vlad. Fails, but he tries. So I find it hilarious that after depicting Vlad as just a brute and Sun Tzu is more of a highly intelligent guy, in the actual fight, they show Vlad as pulling a prank on Sun Tzu, and Sun Tzu deciding that he has to die for it. And I mean, look, this is like a death battle double stretcher for getting the characters to fight. Honestly, it also might have been better, but I think, I don't know. Anyway, moving on, we have the French Musketeers versus the Ming Warriors. Now, the French Musketeers did have some overlap with the Ming, so this isn't one of their worst matches. But I would kind of agree that the French Musketeers would win. They were around for longer and would have had more advanced weapons and armor at the end of it, especially. Or at least more advanced weapons. I don't think they used armor by the time they were disbanded. But now, as to the weapons, I don't object to the French Musketeers' weapons or the Ming's weapons. And I do kind of agree with most of the advantages they get, especially at least for the situation they're in, though I would like to note a few things. First off, the rapier that the Musketeers would have used in battle, in the cases where they would have been thicker than the civilian rapier that most people think of. Most rapiers were designed for dueling, but there were also battlefield-specific rapiers that were thicker and more durable as a result. And also, another thing I would like to note, quite frankly, is that the Musketeers, or at least well, now we're not talking about the average French Musketeers here. We're talking about the Musketeers you read about in books and such. And it's that the King's Musketeers, as they were called, because they were more an elite force than the average Musketeers, were primarily a cavalry force, like knights were, and like samurai were. But all three of those warriors are depicted as fighting on foot in the show. And so, yeah, it's a bit weird how they depict the actual foot soldier, the Persian immortal, as fighting on a chariot, but they have three groups of horsemen. And actually, Vlad fought mostly on horseback, too. So let's say 4 horsemen fighting mostly on foot. Though Vlad also... Oh, right, another thing I should add about the Vlad thing is that if we actually look at their experience, I think Vlad gets an even bigger advantage, because Vlad actually fought in single combat twice, basically deciding battles with duels. Yes, that was rare, but it did happen. Vlad did it twice and easily won both times. So Vlad definitely has a lot of experience in personal fighting, and the Turks themselves know what how great a warrior he was when he was training under them. Now, finally, for Season 2, not Season 3, we have Apache versus Mongol. And there are just some fucking weird choices for the Mongols. Sorry, not Apache, Comanche. So, first off, look, the Mongol would win unless they give the Comanche firearms. Because the Mongol, simply put, has better armor. But no, they have better armor, especially if you take the Mongols who wear metal armor. But here's the thing: if they give a Comanche a gun, then obviously they're going to win. But another problem I have is the weapon choices they gave the Mongol. So both the Comanche and the Mongol have bow and arrow, but in this case, when they compare them, I think this is more testing the guy who they're using to use that. This is more testing the skill of the guy who's using it than the arrow itself. And by that, I mean the modern person using it, not the trained Mongol or trained Comanche warrior. Because if we look at the actual period sources on Mongols, they can hit people far further away than what they show these guys as shooting at. So, but I'm not going to judge them too much for that. What I am, however, going to do is judge them for giving the Mongols primarily a flanged mace and a glaive. They do also give the Mongols a saber, and they compare it to a scalping knife, which, you should give the Mongols the dagger they would have used, and then give them a saber in place of a flanged mace. I do think the Mongols did use maces sometime, but they weren't one of their main weapons. Honestly, if you wanted to keep the flanged mace, you should have probably given them a gunpowder bomb as a special weapon. But I suppose that would have made it a bit too obvious. But also, the glaive is my main objection. So the main Mongol mid-range weapon would have been a lance. Mongols had their own lances. These would have been used by heavy cavalry who use metal lamellar armor as opposed to the horse archers who would have worn lighter armor. But the Mongols did have lances. Now, did they use glaives? I am doubtful of them using it. So there might be some evidence of them using it sometimes, but they would have used lances more often. Now the final season. Most of the fights here are most of the fights here are person versus person, as in famous person versus famous person, not like other such things, not like with armies, not like smaller things. So, and also one of the things I should note is that they introduced something called X Factors, which are basically meant to be things that aren't the weapons themselves, but could impact a fight. Could decide a fight. So, for example, someone could potentially have better weapons, but lose because, say, they're not as good with them. And the X Factors only impacted one of the fights. Yeah, the rest of them were all decided by weapons. Anyway, George Washington versus Napoleon Bonaparte. Yeah, this is the fight where the show truly jumped the shark, and we haven't even gotten to the vampires versus zombies fight. But yeah, Deadliest Warrior said that George Washington would beat Napoleon, which is complete bullshit. Look, even the most patriotic and history-ignorant Americans know that Washington was not as good as Napoleon. So, was Washington a bad general? No, he wasn't. He wasn't a good general either. He was okay. He certainly wasn't a military genius like Napoleon. Yeah, this is where people really started calling the show out, because come on, there's no one in America who would, aside from complete idiots, who would say that Washington would beat Napoleon. Next up, Jeanne d'Arc versus William the Conqueror, where the show said that William said that this was their first female warrior, even though female warriors appeared on the CIA versus KGB one. Anyway, he says it's a battle of the sexes, but that doesn't really now, that's not really, since Joan of Arc is several hundred years ahead of William the Conqueror, and had far better weapons and armor, including primitive gunpowder weapons. Like, this is a late medieval knight versus an early medieval knight, where they give the late medieval knight a strength handicap. Like, William the Conqueror would not win. There are some, simply because his weapons couldn't even scratch John's armor. Like, what the fuck is he gonna do against someone in plate? I mean, there are some early medieval knights who I think, and warriors and such, who I think could beat a late medieval one, or who could beat Joan d'Arc. Like, even Norman knights, like Robert Guiscard, would probably be able to do it. But I don't think William the Conqueror is one of them. Like, no, he just doesn't have the sheer skill advantage he'd need to be able to win with the technology disadvantage. Now, next up, Genghis Khan versus Hannibal Barca. Also, I'm looking at the ages, and some of them are a bit weird, that, like, when they're saying the warriors were fighting. They have it be Washington in his 40s against Napoleon in his 30s, which is, like, a bit weird, because both of them in their prime might have been a bit earlier than that. I know. They have Joan d'Arc at 17 against William the Conqueror at 38, which, I mean, you'd think that if you were fighting at their prime, you would have aged up John by a few years, because she was a legal adult by modern standards when she died. She didn't die at 17. William the Conqueror was like 38, yeah, I mean, you can still fight pretty well in your 30s, but you're not in your prime anymore. And now for Genghis Khan versus Hannibal, it's 39 Genghis Khan against 26-year-old Hannibal. Like, I don't get what they're going on with his ages. Anyway, they do give Genghis Khan much better options in weapons than the previous Mongol, giving him a saber, a lance, and a bow. Hannibal has once again, a sword, a spear, and a war elephant, and I agree with Genghis Khan winning, because, like, come on. Hannibal was in fucking Roman times, Genghis Khan was in the Middle Ages. There's a pretty big technological difference between them. Now, next up, they have Ivan the Terrible, in terms of ancient battles, Ivan the Terrible versus Hernan Cortez. And this was actually one where Ivan the Terrible had overall more advantage, but had, like, overall the better weapons. Like, he had more advantages in weapons, but Cortez won because he had more X factors. So yeah, this is like the only battle where it was decided by X factors. Now, okay, so here's the thing though. So who would win between them? Honestly, it's a pretty close matchup. Like, most of these matchups weren't that close, but this one I kind of get how it's close. So Cortez was a brilliant military commander. Ivan was really good too. They were both utterly ruthless as well. And ultimately, it's difficult to say who would win, so I give them full credit in this one that, yeah, this is a pretty close matchup. And next up, we have French Foreign Legion versus Gurk. Actually, you know what? No, wait. Let's see. Well, oh, yeah, no, these are modern matchups. So, for the final matchup of this, we have vampires versus zombies, in which they test several hundred zombies against, like, 3 vampires. Oh, yeah, it says right here, 3 vampires versus 189 zombies. And I have one thing to say to this. If it takes 189 of your guys to take out 3 of their guys, you are not deadlier than them. Thank you for watching, everyone, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe.